This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second of this series on hosted by the Refugee Council and Refugee Law Initiative. Let me start by saying happy birthday to the Refugee Council. It must surely be a bittersweet moment, because who would have thought 60 years ago, when the convention was signed and the Refugee Council was formed, that here we would be in 2011 facing similar, if not greater, challenges when it comes to handling refugee issues and welcoming and treating humanely those who seek refuge, not just in this country but across the world. So it must be a bittersweet birthday. If you feel angry about any of that, this is the pledge the Refugee Council is asking people to sign. If you sign it, you get a nice badge like this. And if enough of us sign it, then I'm sure this government will take action. And after all, if Migration Watch can get a petition with tens of thousands of people, surely the Refugee Council can match or better that in terms of seeking the humane treatment of refugees in this country. I think a seminar series like this, looking at integration issues, especially looking at the new challenges, I suppose, is also very timely, because for those of us who've worked in or on refugee or migration issues for any length of time will know that there are always new challenges, but sadly there are always also old challenges when it comes to integration. And I think there's never a wasted opportunity to reflect a little bit on how we as a humane society can get better at integration, if you can accept the definition of what better is. And so I'm really delighted that we have with us Dr. Maja Korac-Anderson, who is a reader in migration and refugee studies in the School of Law and Social Sciences. That's what it's called this week.
Yes.
At the University of East London. Maja's bio is in that little blue and white sheet that you may have in front of you. But for those of you who don't know Maja or her work, she's a very well-known figure in the world of refugee studies. She's worked at the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford, in New York, in Canada, in Serbia, at the University of Belgrade. She's published and worked extensively on issues to do with gender, conflict and development, but also migration and integration. And she's going to talk to us about refugee-centred versus state-centred approaches to integration, processes, practices, and narratives. I was told that I was supposed to sort of make some very interesting remarks to whet your appetite before Maja takes the floor, and I couldn't think of much that was interesting. Except perhaps the irony that the right to seek refuge is arguably the most fundamental right that we have, because it's the right to seek protection from a state, in particular persecution. So all of our other fundamental human rights are given to us, usually by the state, or at least are protected by the state. But when that state turns on you, you have this one right, which is to seek refuge. And if you do, you turn up to a country like the United Kingdom, then you face this irony, which is, well, I think you face this irony, that you are then encumbered with and are processed by the most complicated system of conditions and regulations when it comes to your life as a refugee, not just in terms of how you're defined and how you're processed, but that whole integration journey that I think Maja is going to talk about. And it seems doubly ironic that here we are today, when there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of people out there protesting at the fact that the state is being withered away or withdrawn from many aspects of life. We all heard the Chancellor yesterday talk about the overblown state and how we're going to have to live with a smaller state. But that applies for every aspect of society, I think, except when it comes to refugees, asylum seekers and migrants, because here is an area where the state is more active than almost any other sector in terms of interfering in the lives of people who happen to be seeking refuge or seeking a new home. So I couldn't think of a more timely moment to hear Maja's thoughts on this topic. I hope that was interesting enough. Maja's going to speak to us, and then we're going to have an open session of question and answers and discussion. So to you.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction and also for inviting me to speak at this seminar series. Focusing on the challenges in refugee integration to mark the 60th anniversary of Refugee Council is welcome and timely because refugees are increasingly confronted with fewer right-based and provision-based options how and where to make home for themselves. In this talk, I would like to address the relationship between the right to establish home in the receiving society and a series of practices of nesting or homemaking and becoming of a place. The insight and understanding of this relationship is important because integration is not only about legally established citizenship rights. Integration is centrally linked also to informal practices or strategies from below, which link diverse people as individuals and groups in different local settings, predominantly cities, in which they struggle to regain control and reconstruct their lives. So understanding and acknowledging these strategies can advance our thinking on how to develop and implement policies that enhance both formal and informal citizenship rights. Because of the growing diversity, particularly in cities, this is becoming increasingly important. Growing diversity requires new forms of public interaction, dialogue, and civic non-ethnic participation that are tied through new forms of informal citizenship practices. These are based on the inclusion of participatory mechanisms that are initiated from below. But states dominate and dictate integration rules, although the logic, form, and practices of homemaking and incorporation are increasingly not fitting them. Scholarly literature, policy documents, as well as public debate, which focus on the practices of economic, social, political, and cultural inclusion of immigrants and refugees in particular, overwhelmingly emphasize the agency of structural and institutional domains of the receiving states. The term integration has been used by different state actors involved in the regulation and support of the processes of incorporation of refugees and other immigrants in receiving societies. But this term, as many have argued, is political, has normative overtones, and implies the way in which newcomers should fit in. It is linked to the notion of nation as home, of fixed and territorially based identities and loyalties, of citizenship based on nationality, as well as on governance and policy structures which are framed within the terms of the nation state. There is no doubt that immigrants, particularly refugees and receiving states, are unequal partners because the state is in many ways determining their opportunities, as we just heard. Conditions of entry, reception process, as well as the membership requirements, are critical for how they become incorporated into receiving societies. However, primary focus on the agency of the receiving state and the institutional mechanisms leaves us without much insight into how the people who are actually kind of managed and guided by the policies of receiving states actually nest themselves in the new sociocultural environments. While the dominant institutional structures are determining their right to establish home, refugees are actively and continuously creating room for maneuver, to borrow from Norman Long. Because the context in which they are trying to do that is severely limiting their options and choices that are available to them. In other words, refugees are agents who actively seek solutions and opportunities to support that allow them dignity and freedom to make decisions about their lives. Agency, as Eva Moravska explains, is both individual as well as a result of exchange among actors, and refers to the ability of migrants to assess their situation, to take decisions, to devise strategies, and to act upon them. She argues that actions of migrants, so including refugees, should be understood as the dialectics of the power to and power over, as they play with or against the different structures while pursuing their purposes. Put differently, actions of migrants and refugees are neither the simple product of structures nor the violation of these structures by their agency. Putting refugees and their agency center stage in discussing integration is enabling our understanding of how they, as real people with individual histories in particular context, in specific points in time, strategize and negotiate between continuity and change, existential needs and long-term life plans, old loyalties and new identities. The intersection of all these processes and practices constitutes integration. Central to this process, which is not linear or stage sequential, are social networks through which they rub along, on, and bridge in places in which they settle or in which they're allowed to settle. Negotiating entry in the new society, as well as this process of becoming of place, are shaped by different forms of contact established by refugees. Through various forms of social interaction, they struggle to create a meaningful life and place for themselves in these new settings and receiving societies. Their social networks create systems of social relations composed of networks of networks. They're also called social fields, which are themselves embedded in power asymmetries. So these networks may be locally situated as well as nationally or transnationally. Many of the contacts they establish and networks they create are initiated and tied through different institutions and institutional structures in particular local settings. For example, certain church organizations, community groups, non-governmental organizations, municipality. But they can also be established through semi-invisible microlinks of sociability linked to more informal contacts between diverse groups of people in urban areas in which they rub along together. And in some contexts and circumstances, not always, develop a positive web of support. Although some argue that avoidance is part of modern city living, cities are also places of encounter. Jane Jacobs, quite a few decades ago, pointed to the importance of social networks developed through seemingly unpurposeful and random contacts of neighbors in cities through which they form social networks of relationships of trust and support. Some of these informal networks of support are embedded in bonding social networks established among co-ethnics, thus within ethnic boundaries. The importance of these types of networks have long been established in refugee studies. They can be indeed instrumental for getting by and also for getting on with life. Some authors also argue that this type of contact represents a protective strategy because ethnic networks can be safe havens for socially or culturally marginalized and excluded immigrant groups. A positive web of support that is created through bridging social networks has been less often acknowledged as a crucial resource for re-establishing lives of refugees and other immigrants. Particularly lacking are explorations of the roles of connections developed between minority, ethnic, and majority groups, and it considered majority bridging networks are most often regarded as a byproduct of a so-called successful integration of individuals who, as some argue, normally cluster together and then develop their own infrastructures, but then in time, so-called successful immigrants make links with mainstream social frameworks. It is important to challenge this notion that it is somehow natural for newcomers to cluster together. This notion implies that ethnic and cultural boundaries are fixed, embedded in shared and unchanged norms, values, as well as sense of
the surrounding noise is really rather like helicopter. Do you speak?
I will try, but I'm already shouting.
Sorry.
So this idea that they cluster together naturally has this implication that these boundaries, cultural and ethnic, are kind of fixed, and they bring them also of this sense of belonging, of community defined in the singular. It also suggests that newcomers themselves first and foremost, can you hear me? Aim to nest themselves within this co-ethnic milieu. But rather than natural, much of this ethnic clustering is about forced associations. The need to form this type of connections and networks is to a great extent constituted and constructed by, and is a consequence of the fact that the organizing principles of incorporating newcomers, including refugees, in receiving societies are conceptualized and based upon their identity and incorporation as ethnic groups or communities. This emphasis on the groups understood as ethnic and on their group cultural rights is often seen as a way of mobilizing their resources within full integration process. This approach has been at the core of multicultural policies of integration as well. Ethnicity is, however, only one dimension of diversity. It always intersects with other axes of difference, such as gender, age, class, occupation, physical ability, and so on and so forth. This emphasis on co-ethnic clustering between receiving societies and ethnic group incorporation makes it difficult to recognize that the process of nesting is a multi-sided practice characterized by dialectic relationship between different types of connections that shape ways of incorporation of refugees in receiving societies. I shall now turn to developing some of these points empirically and in reference to the narratives and experiences of refugees in Rome and Amsterdam. This is based on my ethnographic study that I'm entitled Remaking Home. And in this research, I examined the situation of refugees from the successor states of Yugoslavia after up to 10 years of living in these two cities. People in my Rome study were relatively young and well educated, originating from urban and semi-urban settings, and at the time of my research, the majority still had temporary humanitarian status renewable on a yearly basis. Only those very few who were married to Italians had Italian citizenship. Their first years in Rome were characterized by a struggle for physical survival because they were provided with hardly any assistance after arriving. As they were admitted on humanitarian grounds and were given a temporary permit to stay, work, and study in Italy by a government decree, that meant without any lengthy determination procedure, they were prompted to rely on their own resources in meeting their most pressing needs. They engaged in intensive networking within and between groups of compatriots, through which they formed an alternative self-reception system to deal with their most pressing needs. As these were predominantly single or cohabiting without children or family in the town, in the city or within Italy, these contacts were based on weak rather than family or kin or close friendship ties, and they were geared toward the kind of fast mobilization of resources. Some faced more difficulties than others. Elderly, for example, or those with children, particularly those with small children, were particularly affected by the lack of any initial support upon their arrival. Also, finding accommodation or jobs on arrival was a gender process, often favoring women. In cities like Rome, which offer opportunities in domestic services, most women found work within a matter of days as live-in housekeepers and nannies, meaning that they also provided not only with work but also accommodation. The situation for men was different and much more difficult. They not only had difficulties finding jobs immediately, but also struggled to find affordable accommodation. Thus, the immediate right to work and or study granted with a humanitarian permit to stay in Italy, combined with the lack of an initial reception system, meant that those more resourceful in terms of their skills or social networks, or those with the right demographic characteristics, were more likely to get by and eventually to get on with their lives by finding their way into the Italian society and its structure. This resourcefulness was not only a matter of having adequate and needing skills for their age, gender, parental, or marital status. In the case of people fleeing the Yugoslav wars, ethnicity was also a powerful resource in settlement. For others, it was detrimental. For Roma refugees fleeing the conflicts, the need to develop these alternative self-reception system in Rome meant that their only possibility of survival was to seek support from their relatives and friends already living in Italy. However, their relatives and friends led segregated lives, living in so-called nomad camps around major cities. This segregation, as some scholars point out, is the consequence of extreme marginalization and exclusion of the Roma population in Italy. So by turning for support to those labeled nomads, Roma refugees from war-torn Yugoslavia settled in Italy have been confronted with segregation, extreme marginalization, experience of racism, social isolation, regardless of their social citizenship rights granted to them on their arrival. In addition to these types of networks, the process of this intensive, informal, and for the most part, spontaneous networking between the people I met and Italians, residents of Rome, also emerged soon after their arrival. Instrumental to this type of connections, not mediated by service providers, were women. Their contacts with Italian families, their employers, and networks of friends were central to facilitating their own functional integration and adjustments. Through language training, diploma recognition, additional skill or knowledge training, they were helped and supported not financially but by inroads how to do that. Women's bridging social networks with Italians helped many men to get by too, by helping them to find first jobs or accommodation. So spontaneous informal contacts with Italian residents of Rome were also often initiated and in different urban settings, ranging from neighborhoods, local markets, shops, cafes, workplaces, educational and other institutions, while these people were searching for some kind of information or help. These initial links were obviously material aid ties, lacking reciprocity and equality, but gradually some developed, obviously not all, into closer emotional aid, social ties described as good friendships, regular outings, joint holidays, and also marriages. At the time of my research, over half of the group had more contacts with Italians than with their compatriots, implying that, explaining that this type of connections are their effort to learn about and understand the culture, but it wasn't really their attempt to assimilate or lose their distinctive identity. Although often described as confrontational or leading to misunderstandings, they weren't easy relationships. These bridging connections enhance the openness of people towards Italians, as well as towards the rules and norms underpinning Italian society and culture, as well as day-to-day life in Rome. Thus, they not only help them to get by or ahead, but also help them to make sense of their new social and cultural environment and to feel of Rome. These bridging networks were helping them to also get inside and feel part of the social fabric of life in the city. Because they were spontaneous, mostly and informal, these contacts were experienced primarily as a two-way communication between and encounters between individuals, not members of diverse, of specific ethnic groups or cultures, but individual members of the diverse groups living in the city and rubbing along together. Because they did not feel socially isolated and excluded at the micro level in any profound way. They also felt more at ease about their uncertain legal status. Although the temporariness of their stay was causing frustration and bitterness at times, their experiences of social inclusion and acceptance at the level of day-to-day lives and contacts with Italian citizens of Rome had a tendency to compensate for the exclusion at the state level. People in my Amsterdam study had similar demographic characteristics as those in Rome, except that they were mostly married, and those who were single had family members in the country. Also, unlike those in Rome, they experienced prolonged and, according to their perception, a humiliating determination procedure involving an over a year-long stay in a so-called reception center. After their asylum applications were accepted, they were offered housing in one of the municipalities, had to undergo compulsory language training, and were offered the possibility of retraining to enhance their prospects of finding employment. Nonetheless, at the time of my research, and unlike in Rome, where everybody was employed, over 1/3 of the people in Amsterdam were unemployed, and that was at the time of a high level of employment in the Netherlands. There were only 3% of the Dutch that were unemployed. Those employed were mostly underemployed, of course. That is a common problem of most refugees in big cities. This phased and state-led process of reception and basic functional adjustment to life in the Netherlands usually lasted for years, and because of the relaxed naturalization policies, at the time of my research, almost all had Dutch citizenship. They were approached as policy objects rather than as agents, and a vital resource in the process of regaining control over their lives. Consequently, they experienced their adjustment to life in the city as a process of control, which was forcing them to follow some kind of integration rules set for them by the state, municipality, and other state-controlled institutions and structures. This top-down approach to integration also affected the establishment of bridging contacts and connections and ties in Amsterdam. The lack of majority links was striking. This social distance did not seem self-imposed, as closer social ties with the Dutch were reportedly very important for the people in my study. However, their connections to the mainstream and the majority society were limited to involuntary, formally established relationships of support with various service providers. These people also became the key mediators between the newcomers and the majority society, as they did not have almost any other contacts with the Dutch. As this type of assistance and support is embedded within the structural framework of minority situation, in which the culture of the receiving society is constructed as superior, the people I met in Amsterdam often found these contacts and forms of assistance not responsive to their goals and life plans, and at times also were perceived as outright humiliating. To fulfill their need for sociability and nesting, people I met in Rome turned to their immediate family members and co-ethnic networks. These experiences, combined with the memories of prolonged stay in reception centers, led to feelings of detachment from Dutch society and the perception of a profound cultural distance between themselves and their Dutch neighbors, co-workers, and fellow citizens of Amsterdam. In contrast to the refugees in Rome, the refugees in Amsterdam lived in the city but felt that they were not of Amsterdam. Their deeply felt social isolation was translated into doubts concerning equality and security of their newly acquired citizenship rights. Many expressed a degree of uneasiness or even fear of a possibility of their citizenship being revoked if the political situation in the Netherlands was to change and somehow was to turn all non-native Dutch into undesired aliens. At this point, a word of caution is required. The way in which the two contexts of my study are juxtaposed here in my talk is not to imply that one is better than the other. The Italian context, briefly outlined here, very briefly, embodied specific structural constraints and caused significant difficulties for refugees, profound for very many of them. Nonetheless, it opened up a space for individual initiative and active participation, and therefore it did not undermine agency. It did so by virtue of not having any systematically implemented assistance for integration. The Italian system was neither institutionally developed to challenge top-down character of integration policies, nor was it concerned with matters of equality. The way refugee integration was approached in Italy was congruent with the government's intention to minimize their assistance and make it fit the character of Italian welfare system, which is non-existent. The absence of policy to assist integration created a fracture within the system that was otherwise exclusionary. For example, it allowed only temporary stay, and naturalization policies are extremely tight. Or it created barriers to employment in specific niches of the labor market, which was practically impossible to penetrate for highly educated people. But this gave some refugees, those more resourceful or of the right ethnic or gender or class background, more space to engage actively in the process of gaining control over their lives. Consequently, the Italian system did not address one of the fundamental questions concerning integration of refugees. How to enhance refugee integration, make the full use of their human capital, and support the establishment of further development of their social capital in the places in which they settle. Very importantly, it did not aim to create a system that would enhance the opportunity to establish a type of intercultural dialogue that leads to this two-way communication, which actually happened between minority and majority groups. This type of dialogue occurred between the group I studied, and Studies and Citizens of Rome, because of their efforts to do so and their strategies to achieve that. This type of communication also was possible because there are many locals, Italians, open to engage with individual people and approach them as a stranger in need. The establishment of these contacts was facilitated by demographic and other characteristics of refugees in my study, which made them tolerable other, although not necessarily a welcome other. Bridging networks between refugees and locals were also formed because of this underdeveloped reception system, which prompted then the creation of these kind of non-institutional, spontaneous links and of support. For all these reasons, it is important to emphasize that this discussion is not not an argument against provision of institutionalized support for refugees, or indeed against their right to gain full citizenship rights. It also does not imply that welfare programs of assistance necessarily create long-lasting reliance on government support. My discussion has aimed to point to the connections between types of policy, structural constraints they embody, and the type of agency they encourage. Very importantly, while it is clear that structural and institutional support for refugees cannot be reduced to generosity and good heart of the local people, which happened in Rome, legal and other policy measures alone cannot solve the problem of inequality and inclusion. And to conclude, if acquisition of formal citizenship rights to inclusion and equality are not accompanied by informal, bridging, micro-level minority-majority contacts and ties, the experience of minority groups will remain strongly shaped by their feelings of otherness, perceptions of inequality and exclusion. This is because the development of trust between minority, ethnic, and majority groups only partially depends on a set of rights that can be granted to the ethnic or minority groups. Challenges in integration of refugees are increasing because of the growing diversity of receiving societies that is prompted by arrival of immigrants, including refugees. This is causing concern about social cohesion, particularly in urban areas. While diversity is often regarded both in scholarly work and policy debates as a problem, it has also been viewed as an asset, particularly in cities, driving innovation and economic growth, for example. Likewise, in social terms, diversity does not necessarily undermine trust among citizens of receiving societies who live in specific settings, as some scholars suggest. Rather, it is segregation that undermines social cohesion. Consequently, the question that needs addressing is how to achieve diversity that is an asset rather than to suffer economic, political, and cultural consequences of segregation and the lack of trust. The question is centrally linked to how integration is understood and conceptualized. Scholars are becoming increasingly aware that the overemphasis on the national unit, the state, results in overly abstract national-level models of integration. Also, increased global connectedness, which prompts transnational processes of nesting and multi-sided homemaking practices, further challenges the notion of national citizenship linked to the nation state. And these processes are making it no longer the main locus of identity. In the past decade, proposals and attempts have been made to focus more on local city level, in which integration actually occurs, within the receiving societies. Refugees and other immigrants overwhelmingly are settling in urban settings, often big cities characterized by super diversity, as some scholars point out. These are the socioeconomic and cultural context of an increased variety of values, viewpoints, and interests, demanding voice and representation through the establishment of various civic non-ethnic initiatives, and such practices go beyond formal citizenship based on legally established national citizenship rights, and should be acknowledged and enhanced.
Thank you very much. I hope you agree with me that was fascinating and thought-provoking and controversial at times.
Controversial.
And I'm sure we'll touch on that. We've got about half an hour or so to have a discussion. I'm going to abuse my privilege as a chair and ask the most obvious question that I know everyone is thinking, so that you're going to have to work harder to come up with your question, which is just to sort of ask how you would apply your analysis to the UK context. So you're saying that there's sort of, so emblematic of how many of us perceive Italy. It's chaotic and disorganized, and the state is completely dysfunctional, but people get by, as do migrants, it seems. And the Dutch are so hopelessly organized that it doesn't always work. Where does Britain fit in terms of its approach to integration?
I've been asked that question several. Yeah, well, Britain, I think, fits somewhere in between, really, in between the two. If we're talking about national level strategies, because there is a kind of overall national integration strategy, but then there are also different points where non-governmental organizations and different other bodies and stakeholders have their role in it, which is more independent than just implementing what the government is saying. So it is somewhere in between.
Thought you might say that. Okay, so over to everyone. Yeah.
So can I just ask, because it's something I'm very interested in, when you looked at bridging networks, did you also consider maybe tangentially bridging networks between incoming groups which were not necessarily connected to the host society? Do you see what I mean?
Yes. Okay. Yes. No, that wasn't my particular focus, but yes, that was also happening, and that is happening actually, and that is happening much more than bridging minority and majority. But my focus was, I was actually really interested to see whether majority and minority is happening. And to go back, so also, unlike London, for example, which is one of these super diverse cities, Rome isn't. So it's a very different setting and socio-cultural environment. So there are many immigrants, but it's a very different type of thing than yes.
Okay, yeah.
When you say that integration, excuse me if I'm paraphrasing you wrongly, but when you say that integration should perhaps not be based on the national model, how does that actually work in practice? What I mean by that is, at the moment, they take a citizenship test. They're very strongly encouraged to learn English, understand how life works here. If refugees were not integrating on a national basis, how would it work differently?
Well, language is one problem which is more or less at the national level, although, I mean, national level in Britain also includes other languages than English. So that's also problematic. But so that's one thing. About the second one you mentioned, but
the citizenship test.
Citizenship test. Well, that is debatable, because there are many British people who actually can't answer these questions. So it is actually a question of what people need to know to become citizens. So that's whether it is integration into national, something that is imagined, that is British or English, or that is something that would have to. That is one at the one national level. But then situation in Britain, and not only in Britain, but in any other country, in terms of integrating, it's very different living and trying to integrate in London or somewhere in Devon, in a small tiny town or village or somewhere. So that is not really national. What people need to know, how, where, it's not national really. It's just our imagination that such thing exists. So language is one thing, of course. So they should speak, I mean, if I'm to be asked, people should speak the language of the majority population. There is no doubt about it, because that's a way of communicating. But then, as I said again, in Britain actually is not only English that is language.
But
And
it's
many
still
other-
the language of communication.
Sorry? Well,
English
it is,
being
yes, but
practiced.
that may be something that the British would like to discuss among themselves as well. Why some others aren't official ones, for example. But that's what I'm saying. So every time we actually go at the national level, we see that there are regional, a place like London is definitely different than the rest of Britain. So integrating in London is very different from integrating somewhere else. So this idea of a national level is something that we somehow don't really touch into, but it's, and also then there are obviously different types of connections which are also translocal but also transnational. So people actually have different citizenship and transnational practices, different loyalties. I would use word split, but different types of connections that change over time. They're not. That's also something about integration, living, moving, returning, and things like that. So I think the concept really of citizenship, some say, for example, Daniel Schaffer, some say it should no longer be national, it should be shared citizenship. But then it's a question of what that shared is going to be. Some scholars go much further than that and say, we should perhaps consider residence citizenship rather than national ones. I do not think that we're nowhere close to that stage, but that may be something that it's hard to actually envisage how that would work, because we still live within the framework of the nation state. But they actually are too rigid to cover what is needed. And not only in integration, we see that there is a problem with that everywhere.
Yeah.
I wonder if you looked at how much awareness the people have of their rights, and the international law, because the whole point for refugees is obviously that, yes, supposedly the nation state is supposed to be granting them their various rights and everything, but that's why the international protection exists. And what we find, I work at the Refugee Council, what we find at the Refugee Council is that people are definitely not anticipating to be getting those benefits, or even understand what benefits are. They wouldn't necessarily have benefits in their country, and they wouldn't be aware that they would have rights under international law when they haven't yet been granted any citizenship rights for any nations. I wondered if there was any sort of awareness amongst the groups that, as people, as human beings, that they might have some entitlements.
There was a process. They became, obviously, because of the reasons for which and how they left their places of origin, and really none of them ever, I think, envisaged that they will become refugees. So they weren't aware in the beginning. They learned in the process, and they learned more, those in the Netherlands than those in Italy. They knew that they were entitled, supposedly in Italy, to this and that, but basically they were never able to get any of what they were entitled to. That is what they were saying, really. But then, again, in the Italian context, actually, they did not refer to themselves, nor did they want to be referred to as refugees. They just didn't, because they were not within that framework. They never were, they were not given that label, the sense, and they wanted to reject it. They were just people who were in particular difficult situation and trying to find their way in Italian society. Where in the Netherlands, because that discourse is very, very strong, the kind of refugee label was something that they dealt with and related to all the time.
But the ones in Italy were conventionally refugees in terms
No, they
okay.
weren't. They weren't.
But
They
the ones
weren't.
in Holland
I said
came.
they were humanitarian status,
Right.
government decree, special one. So they didn't go. That there were 3 or 4 groups at a time that got that. So in that sense, they didn't have any prolonged kind of procedure. Not all people who are in Italy have that kind of treatment. This was quite exceptional, actually, I have to say, so it's very different.
Hi. It appears that both states had either or didn't have policies in place for integration, were discriminating against the refugees. So both seems in a way discriminated in many ways towards refugees. But what was your feeling of how do people feel in Holland or Rome? Which one did they feel they were worse discriminated? How did the people feel themselves?
Yeah, okay, well, one point of clarification, actually, people in the Netherlands were, how would I say, discrimination wasn't a legal one. Their rights were everything was by the book, and more than that. And they got full citizenship rights very soon, basically after their arrival. Everything was, so in that sense, their rights were cared for, what is kind of a Geneva Convention or, box here and there. Everything was okay. And that is my point, really. That it is not, that is important, but it is not the whole story. And also, the way how that may be implemented may also in itself create a feeling and experience that is actually an experience of humiliation, although it is actually about someone's human rights. Because if you're shut in a reception center and before you are allowed to go and, in your room, you're actually strip searched. And if something, and all of that is for, health and safety or whatever, and all of that, that, although they were given, a nice room and meal to have, everything was there, really. But that is something that needs also rethinking. So that's about rights, and so. But then, in terms of if you are asking me in terms of kind of social isolation, yes, they did not feel really kind of that they did not complain of racism or anything like that. No, but they just felt that they're absolutely invisible. Those, I'm not talking about those who lived on benefits and did not work. I'm talking about those who were medical doctors, and at the time when I was there, were working as medical doctors in hospitals.
Okay, I've got a few people lined up for questions. I'll come to the back in a second, but I'll go here and then to Paresh.
I just wondered what role and how important the discourse between the national apparatus and its own citizenship plays in the relationship and the integration of refugees, because I get a sense that within the UK, people respond to refugees based sometimes on some political press and so on responses. And I sense that there is no leadership that actually challenges all of these things. And I wondered whether there was any way that you could tell whether the discourse between the people and their leaders made any difference for refugee integration.
I'm terribly sorry, but I'm not sure that I quite got your, possibly because I was talking too much and I wasn't able, I'm extremely sorry, but I didn't get actually the point of your question. Could you just rephrase it? Terribly sorry. Citizenship, national citizenship?
The relationship between the governments,
okay,
or government apparatus and its own citizenship, its own citizens.
Okay.
Whether that had implications on how refugees could integrate with those citizens. And because of how I sense that refugees and migrants are political football, and I don't know what leadership at government level, how that translates into
okay. Yes. So they're very often used and misused by all kinds of political. Yes, but something that is something that obviously that kind of scapegoat, basically, that they're always putting emphasis on where there is a. Do you mean that this kind of discourse in which refugees, particularly refugees, but immigrants as well,
I don't know
who are
whether
threatening.
there were any government efforts to actually make refugees acceptable, or whether people stood down and actually made statements, or in the UK, for instance, when you look
I know
at
what you're saying. You're saying there is political influence about the way
people are perceived.
Public opinion.
Yes.
That's what he's saying. I understood him right from the beginning.
Yes.
So why don't you understand him?
Yeah. Sorry.
I think part of it is that.
Yeah, I understood him right from the
Well,
first.
thank you
I
very
think part
much.
of it is that.
Yeah, there is this kind of discourse, yes, and that is really what is feeding into this whole idea that is actually making integration difficult. Yes, and I think that a big part of it is also actually related to labels, right? Because although, and I may now say something that is really, although it is extremely, and it has been extremely important for refugees to have all these kind of advocates and advocating for refugee rights and interaction. But actually this kind of legal label really became something that, you don't see people behind the label. Or, this question, are they a refugee or asylum seeker? As there are not people behind it, as there aren't any histories behind it, any identities, any goals, any ideas, just some sort of... So that is something that has been constructed. And although I fully support further advocacy for refugee rights, but at the same time, it is extremely important that that advocacy makes somehow this point visible that we are talking about people, or maybe very different actually also, not all the same, and who then require different types of support to be able to help themselves to reconstruct their lives.
So, satisfactorily understood and answered?
I'm terribly sorry for a problem in...
Okay, all right. You can talk more at the free drinks reception after.
Okay.
Fresh.
Dr. Korac-Anderson, please add my thanks for a very good talk. Essentially, I can understand it from the perspective of adult asylum seekers who come, enter a structure, become objects of policy, and seek out opportunities to integrate. How about unaccompanied minors who don't necessarily have the same opportunities, who may not have the same level of understanding, the same support structures that adults may have? What problems do they experience in integrating, and moreover, did you come across any unaccompanied minors or indeed children of asylum seekers either in Rome or Amsterdam?
No, unaccompanied minors were not part of my study because that would have been a totally different, but I'm glad you asked the question because I would like to kind of re-emphasize something that I tried to make clear in this presentation, and that is that the group of people in my research is a specific group of people, and that, as I said before, refugees are a very, very diverse group of people. So equally in my study there were those who came with very small children. They had profound difficulties. So if we are talking about support, and again to go back to the question of national policy, what we are really talking about, it can't be one fits all. It is important that whatever solution is there or whatever support is there is in a way tailor-made for different groups. So, you know, if you have elderly people, if you have those who have physical and other difficulties, that's a very different type of thing. When you have, you know, a group of 25 to 35 or 40, well, you know, really wanting to reconstruct their lives and do something about it. They come with, you know, human capital, where they come. So it's a very different thing. So yes, I agree that, you know, there should be different type of support for different groups of people.
Okay, we'll go back to the gentleman there and then. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in your understanding and the use of state-centered approach to integration, particularly in the context of a massive onslaught against multiculturalism. Right across Western Europe, starting in Britain, Italy, Amsterdam, Germany, multiculturalism has failed. It's not good, it's not working, and we need to roll back. And if you talk and discuss issues with asylum and immigration in an atmosphere of fear and constant insecurity, it's obvious that this minority groups of people will seek solace in individual ethnic communities where they feel more comfortable. How does the state promote, on one hand, integration in an atmosphere where you are at the same time dismantling the structures that help minorities cope with problems of insecurity and fear within societies? I wonder if you have any particular take on those two conflicting aspects of international migration.
Yes, I think that there is obvious kind of backlash against multiculturalism. I think that, well, are you referring to this state that is dismantling some structures that support multicultural policies, or?
I'm just interested in your take.
Yeah, well, I would say that multiculturalism, the way it has been conceived and implemented, in my view, does not work. And I perhaps can be viewed as an ethnic minority, but I don't think that that it really helps people be incorporated in a society as individuals and with a spectrum of things that is one's identity. my identity is only, and I think everyone's really, only one element and layer of it is my culture, and also that's also problematic from where I come from, what my culture is or what is, and I think for every single, So, but to go back, it's not really about me or you, it's about other things. So I think that multiculturalism, in a sense, and as an idea, which is promoting diversity, which functions, which works, which is diversity that is supporting the dialogue, and diversity in which I or you don't have to assimilate and forget our language, where we come from, what we like or don't like. That is fine. And that is really what should be supported, and that is what I think diversity should be about, but not segregation. And I think what happened in many of these receiving states is actually that we're talking about segregated communities. And I really don't think that that is something that works, and not only from the point of view of these states and their governments, but from the point, I wouldn't want to be a part of an ethnic community in any country. I want to be a citizen. And when I want to be something else, I'm going to be, but I'm going to be that because I'm going to engage in whatever civil or civic organization there is, in which I can then find links with people, like-minded people. But where I live, I want to be included as in all elements of my identity, and I think that that is something that that is equality. Because otherwise, who is going to represent me in my ethnic community? I don't know, or I want to be represented like that.
Okay, we're running out of time, but shall I take a bunch of questions, if you will, permit? So to the lady in the back and the gentleman here, one very final question. I'll take all of them and then I'll give you a chance to sort of answer all of them very quickly. Yeah.
I just want to ask, because you mentioned about the importance of women's informal networks in terms of facilitating integration. I just wondered if you had any observations or reflections around the way men and women, or gendered approaches to integration, and the challenges that maybe the genders face. And it's a bit kind of generalised, but
yes. Well, but it is difficult to generalize, as I say. So the Roman case in Rome was very specific in a sense that simply because of the type of the labor market and jobs available and everything, women were actually much, much better off. And also, when I say better off, it's because also being a housekeeper or living housekeeper or nanny was not a kind of dead-end job. They were like stepping stones for all these women. They did not end up being 10 years after the same. They actually ended up doing other things. So that was for them. So that was a specific case, and it's not always it's not for all women, and not always. And in these, so in this specific context, and as always with gender and everything else, it's very difficult to generalize. In the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, was actually different situation because there was this support. So what happened there is like a more common gender pattern, in which when there was this retraining was offered, then women were, and also because they were mostly married, whereas couples, whereas in Rome were single people more. So those married, then they would then kind of negotiate and most often would be the husband going for not retraining, but diploma recognition, which takes more time for if, you know, and the wife would go, although also a medical doctor, would go to be a nurse. Because it costs more money to do both. They can't, so it was more, and that is a kind of gender pattern that is found in many places. The Rome situation was really specific because of the specific situation of the job market. And
Thank you. Dylan?
Yes, my question goes back to when we talked about the different types of support for different individuals who seek safe haven, and I mean, ideally, like personally, we prepare differently depending on the type of guests we expect, and I felt at some stage that say in the UK it's a good dream, and the question was like it led to I was thinking what chances of successful positive integration of refugees have. What is the chance in the state which expects refugees not to come?
expects refugees not to come.
At the same time claiming that they are reluctant to integrate into something that they don't, not sure themselves they want. Refugees.
But do we know actually of a really welcoming state for to refugees, with open door to refugees? I mean,
Anyone?
Canada used to be a state that was proud to, but I, you know, that's also no longer. So yes.
I just recently heard about the case of Malta with there's this really small island before the upheaval in Libya. This particular really, sorry, I can't remember the name of the people were really welcoming and quite cool. No, it's another small
probably
island.
not.
No, it's not that one, it's another one, where the people didn't mind if refugees came because there was not very many of them arriving. But after Libya, there was so many people came that the people out on that island actually became quite racist because they were overwhelmed with the number of people coming from Libya. But I'm sorry, I can't remember. It's not Lampedusa. It's another one.
I think it's about Lampedusa, but it's not really true that they were very welcome because the mayor of the Lampedusa, I'm sorry, the mayor of Lampedusa is actually side of Italy. A few years ago was a member of the North League Party, and it's actually strange, and they're very racist in Italy. They're quite well known. And if you think that the mayor of Lampedusa was a person from North League Party.
I don't want to be accused of being a bad chair, so I don't want to let this overrun too much. I promised this lady here one last question.
I was wondering whether you have ever experienced, you were mentioning before the idea that in a state-centered approach, there's this reception facility, which basically is a state approach to integration through language learning, and these tests are necessary. But have you ever experienced that situation, which when coupled with the idea of a refugee being a label, and to an extent a victimizing label, because you're a victim, and you need aid, you need help, and you depend on it to a certain extent, whether when they come together, those two exist together, people would be almost reluctant to leave such a state-centered approach. So they would be stuck with the reception facility which exists, and
You mean that they become dependent on the support they're receiving, or because?
To a certain extent, yes. Dependent in the sense that there's absolutely no motivation, or very little motivation, to actually move out of the same system, which is, in what you were saying, humiliating them.
Well, again, it is very, very difficult to generalize, because, you know, we're talking about different situations, different people, at different points in time. But there are things that we know from different types of research and also my own research with people who actually were in these centers, for example. And we know that for refugees, very often, if it's a center, this kind of reception center, however awful it may be, after a journey, after you deal that they go through, the first couple of weeks, or depending, it's very difficult to say. It's a kind of, you know, they would say, and they were saying, some were saying to me in the Netherlands, you know, we didn't mind really being with 15 other people in this room. We needed time to really think about what happened, and, you know, but when that thing then continues for months, weeks, months, and then no, I mean, it's, you know, people, and also, well, depends, you know, if you're in your late 50s or 60s or something, and, you know, you don't really, you think about, how am I going to go about my life now, totally starting from scratch. But then there were those actually who came with, and it's in every situation like that, who came full of plans and ideas and goals, what they want to do. They didn't want to miss a single hour. They wanted to learn the language, to find out how they can retrain or recognize these diplomas and start their life all over again. And then it was absolute shock and disaster realizing that they won't be doing that, not next week or next month, but perhaps not in 2 years, because the process will not, yes. And also, you know, one thing is when you're low qualified and you start learning language with those who are, for example, illiterate and everything, so you go over. And if you're highly qualified and you want to learn language to the extent that you actually can use it fast and do something about your life. But when you come to this kind of system, you're all up together and there is no way out.
Even the families where you said it was very, very challenging.
No, that was, I'm talking here about reception center and these places that existed in the Netherlands. But the people I talked to, in Italy there were some reception centers at the very beginning for people fleeing wars in Yugoslavia. But that was really only temporary for a very, very short period of time. And it wasn't really this type of, that was very, but people in Rome, they were just there arriving and then having to find their way around. That was nothing.
Okay, let me try to draw that to a close. I mean, I thought that was very fascinating. I hope you agree with me. I can't help but think that what you're talking about is also about the very social contract that citizens have with the state they live in. You happen to do research in two countries with very different social contracts with a general citizenship, but then superimposed on that, two very different approaches to how newcomers, particularly refugees, are treated. You said that one wasn't necessarily better than the other, and I kept asking myself, you know, where would I want to be a refugee? Maybe in the spirit...
Nowhere. I tell you nowhere you want to.
But in the spirit of public participation, and given that we all watch the X Factor secretly, who would rather be a refugee in Rome?
I would go home.
Right? Yeah. You're biased. All right. And who would pick to be a refugee in the Netherlands? All right. So one evenly split between those who'd rather sink or swim and those who'd rather have this sort of state-sponsored, slightly paternalistic, sometimes ineffective response.
Can I have another question?
All right, go on.
Of those who raised hands, how many had experience of being refugee?
All right.
Just thought.
Okay, fair enough.
Curious.
Audience participation. This is all good. Okay, let me just say a few words of a very quick thank you. Thank you to Maja for stimulating us in the way that you have. And I'm sure you'll be around for questions and discussions afterwards. Thank you in particular to the Refugee Council, Ben, Lara, Rebecca. Thank you very much to the Refugee Law Initiative, to Korac, for putting together not just this event, but this whole series. Remember, this is the second. The next is on the 14th of December, and it will be here. At Senate House. Okay, 14th of December, more details to come for those who are interested. And remember, if you want a pretty badge like this, you have to sign the pledge. My favourite phrase in the English language, free drinks. Out that door and to the right, because we're all heading to the right these days. Thank you very much.